You're listening to BioTalk with Rich Bendis, the only podcast focused on the biohealth capital region. Each episode, we'll talk to leaders in the industry to break down the biggest topics happening today in biohealth.
Hi, this is Rich Bendis. I'm your host for BioTalk. And we have a new topic that has never been on BioTalk in our over 120 episodes we've done, and it's really one of the most important that's emerging today. And it really relates to data and how you protect it and data integrity. And with everything that's going on post-pandemic and during the pandemic with remote workers and our workforce changing, our data has to be managed in a different way. And we have an expert in this field to be on BioTalk today. His name is Gaurav Walia, and he has the longest title of anybody that's ever been on BioTalk. So I'm going to read it for you. He's the Senior Director of Business Development and Principal Computer Systems Validation and Data Integrity Consultant and Senior Associate Partner with the PQE Group. Gaurav, welcome to BioTalk.
Thank you, Rich. Appreciate that. Thanks for the kind introduction.
You're welcome. And you're going to tell us about everything that's included in your title, and we're going to discuss all those different areas today. What we'd like to do, first of all, Gaurav, is rather than me introduce you, there's nobody better to introduce yourself than you. So why don't you give our listeners an introduction to your background, please?
So, as Rich said, my name is Gaurav Walia. I've been in the pharmaceutical medical device industry for 26 plus years. I started my career pretty much from the ground up. After my master's degree in biology and chemistry, I started as an analytical chemist, basically working in research and development. In the beginning of my career, I quickly moved up the food chain, if you will, and up to Associate Director of Research and Development, basically inventing new innovative drugs, including, at that time, the first moderate to late-stage Alzheimer's medication. After that, I pivoted into the quality space. Since I was involved in a lot of FDA inspections, even as a research director, I moved into become a director of quality for several firms, where over the course of my career, I have over 100 plus FDA inspections under my experience, as well as several other international regulatory inspections. And then on top of that, more attributable to this topic today is 3 major consent decree projects for large firms, focusing on computer system validation and data integrity. After which, basically spent 10, 11 years purely on the road doing consulting, working at various small to large companies for different projects, from computer system validation or implementing new technologies to doing gap assessments, defining where the risks, where the gaps lie, and helping major organizations fix or remediate these issues, whether it's in a laboratory, manufacturing space, or anything in between. My first dealing with PQE Group was about 3.5 years ago when I joined them on a large remediation project. And after 3 months, ironically, my client stole me away from PQE Group and made me their regional director. And then I became the client at that time for 2 years for PQE Group. And after a merger of that company, they decided to shut down some facilities, and hence PQE had approached me to come back. And here we are today, where I manage some major clients and so focus computer system validation, data integrity space.
Well, thank you, Gaurav. Great introduction. And I got introduced to PQE through Debbie Kaufman, who is located in Bethesda and regional representative for the PQE Group, which I had not heard of before. And I would imagine there's a lot of our listeners, even though you have a great number of clients around the world, that have not heard of PQE. Can you give us an introduction to what PQE is and what you do primarily?
PQE Group was founded in Italy in the late 90s, and basically since then has grown tremendously globally. PQE Group is a global consulting firm, one-stop shopping for items like compliance, quality assurance, commissioning and qualification, CSV, data integrity projects, you name it. So today we stand at 2,000 plus employees. We've grown significantly even just during COVID. Just a few years ago, we were only 500 employees. We've also expanded from originally in our infancy when we started in our first year from one office to today, where we stand at 22 legal entities and over 40 plus offices spanning from Latin America to as far as Australia today. For somebody that's worked at 7 or 8 different consulting firms, as well as spent more than half of my career in industry, what I can tell you is that One of the nice benefits, I think, with this organization, even just from a company standpoint, is it kind of follows that old school US mentality where there's a significant amount of permanent employees, whereas in traditional consulting firms in the United States, it's just almost what we call a body rental. They're just getting people to satisfy a project and then the relationship ends, more or less. Whereas in our organization, we have people that have been in the organization since day one. So it just talks about the level of quality of the individuals that you get. If you have repeat projects or even just the relationship between clients I think is a different animal in that you can build upon that relationship, whereas in other organizations, it's almost one and done. By chance, you may cross paths, but from a different company or a different person in a different fashion, I guess you could say.
So you have a little differential advantage versus some of your competitors, you're saying?
Yes, and I think the trend today is that a lot of large companies or even down to startups, I think today companies are starting to find that there's a lot of choices in the market, but at the end of the day, what people really want is that where they don't have to have a surprise where after a 1 hour interview or resume that the person is not what it appears, or that sometimes the hiring manager of clients has to spend too much time with the consultant. And at the end of the day, let's not forget this is consulting. So you shouldn't have to handhold the consultant too much, especially when you're hiring them to do a specific task. So I think this is what the industry is leaning towards these days, and really having that relationship with the firms, with the individuals, and also the success and the efficiency of the work that's being done, more or less.
Sure, I understand it's all about the people relationships. And can you talk a little bit about the industry focus? And since we're focused in biohealth and life sciences, where that rates based on all of the other industries you might service?
Primarily, it's pharmaceutical, medical device, as well as emerging industries like biotech, for example, or biologics. So it's basically in the healthcare region of manufacturers of either pharmaceutical products or medical device as a high-level summary.
So I would say then you're a pure play where your primary interest and focus lies and expertise in the whole life science and biohealth industry rather than being a general consulting firm that services many industries.
That's correct. I think the focus is in that space. I mean, we do dabble in some other areas as well, but that's the primary focus.
So let's get into some of the areas that relate to the industry today that are becoming increasingly important. Let's talk about the importance of computer systems validation, and is referred to as CSV, and some of the new regulatory trends that have emerged since COVID-19.
So as you mentioned, CSV or computer system validation, very simply put, high level, is ensuring that the software or computerized systems that are being utilized today, and maybe 40 years ago when everything was paper-based, that's the difference today. Many companies have automated their technologies or gone to moving away from paper, let's just say. And so this is really ensuring that the testing or validation of these systems, whether it's a laboratory system, HPLC, which is utilized high level for testing of the drug's purity or impurities, which in many cases, some of the impurities could cause side effects to a human, or it could be a manufacturing technology that's making the tablet that you take, or an injectable if you have, for example, if you take insulin for diabetes, and also general systems, building monitoring system or environmental monitoring system. At the end of the day, the main focus today is really ensuring about the data integrity, the product quality, and ultimately the patient safety in this regard. I think during COVID is a unique time, even it's still today, as some trends do go up and down regarding COVID or different regions of the world. In the last 20 to 30 years, we truly become a multinational global entity when it comes to not only our firm, but just the business alone of pharmaceutical and medical device manufacturing. So what is one of the biggest gaps that has occurred during COVID? Well, I think that the biggest gap is obviously the travel, including the agency as well, had huge travel restrictions. In one space alone, for example, if you are buying a lot of different technology or computerized systems or software, one of the requirements is to audit those vendors and do a vendor risk management program that basically shows that their quality systems are good. And that is a gap that could not occur very often, including during COVID because of travel restrictions. So somebody might have 200 vendors they deal with, and they might go inspect them every couple of years, for example. So how do you go to India or China during COVID to do that? And how do you replace that function if you cannot? And so this tends to be, even before COVID, a big gap in where industry is not really checking those vendors so much and the quality systems. So overall, the major gap during COVID regarding CSV and or data integrity is that we're not able to go and check the companies that we're doing business with, even within our own companies. Sometimes, for example, a large client that may have 100 sites in the globe, where they might have two main ways to check if they're doing well from a computer system validation or data integrity standpoint. One might be internal audits and the other might be a regulatory inspection. So in the last few years, let me give you an example. I've spoken at least 10 to 15 conferences in the last couple of years. I've been speaking at conferences for the last 25 years, and I will tell you that I would poll the audience in the last couple of years and ask them, well, how many people have returned to work normally? And a lot of people, even today, would say it's still limited, or that maybe they're on a hybrid methodology. The next question will be, well, how many people are pursuing business as normal now that COVID is either current a couple of years back or now decreasing? And the answer is most companies are still either not performing internal audits or corporate quality checks or at a reduced level. There wasn't many hands being raised no matter which question I asked, and it became less and less till I got to the last question. The last question was, how many people have had a regulatory inspection? And I could tell you that over the course of 10 conferences with maybe a couple thousand people, maybe less than two handfuls had raised their hand, which means that we're not checking our own data, we're not checking our own systems, and it's also not being checked, at least at the normal frequency prior to COVID from a regulatory standpoint. And again, these are limitations that we have during COVID. So I think, and this happens to be not to promote too much about PQE, but it's one of the technologies we have, is that we do have some technologies using augmented reality or virtual reality glasses, as well as some connectivity tools where it allows us to not only do a vendor inspection remotely, basically any part of the pharmaceutical business, whether it's inspection, it's validating a computerized system, checking for gaps in data integrity. We're able to do these projects, as we've done many of them, remotely, utilizing these technologies. And we're seeing some uptick in a lot of companies as well, even within the organizations, where they're trying to utilize technology to come up with the hybridized approach or even a completely remote approach. And this obviously also is helpful, as well as curing the backlog internally of not being able to check this data or doing an audit.
So times are changing, but you mentioned the term regulatory inspection. For those novices who are not in this field, in the data field, talk about who performs a regulatory inspection, when is it required, and basically what you've mentioned, very few people are raising their hands that have gone through regulatory inspections. So talk a little bit about regulatory inspections in general, which I haven't heard much about.
These are in the United States. This would be basically your FDA inspection. Outside the United States, wherever you're selling that product, could be different governmental agencies similar to the FDA globally that would be inspecting these firms. So traditionally, in the pharmaceutical medical device industry, we're regulated by the Food and Drug Administration here in the United States, as well as several counterparts around the globe, similar in this to the agency itself, or referred to either as the FDA or the agency that perform these regulatory inspections. These inspections typically can vary for different reasons. Let's just say in a normal practice, typically every 2 years, there's a GMP inspection that's performed just to see the quality and health of the organizations producing products. When somebody has done a filing for a drug or a device, they can have a pre-approval inspection, basically allowing them basically a future approval of the product. And then if there's an issue, there's a recall or an issue that's been notified to the government regarding a particular product or a company, then they also could come quickly on the spot due to a product quality issue that could affect the patient safety. There's obviously other instances, but these are the major instances of a regulatory inspection, if you will, or FDA inspection.
And based on where we are today, with some of the challenges and changes that have occurred, would you say that the regulatory inspections are now basically reactive rather than proactive, and basically they're only occurring when something has happened that stimulates the need for an inspection to occur?
No, the regulatory inspections still occur as needed. It's just starting back up, as you can imagine, with the previous restrictions or heavy restrictions with travel and COVID over the last several years. Some are reactive in the sense that if there's product quality issues, for example, globally in the last year, there's been cough syrup contamination where 500 plus children under 5 years old have died in several countries. Just in the last couple of months, there's been eye drop contamination where people have died or gone permanently blind. And then there's instances where companies have a track record of not performing or not doing things right. So the reinspection or rechecking of those companies that could pose a risk, even in just the examples I gave, come under a little bit of further scrutiny, rightfully so. I think that's the current operation. There is a significant backlog. I think things have picked up again nicely starting the beginning of this year globally in terms of regulatory inspections, because everybody's had a break, if you will, both from internal checks or quality inspections within the organization, as well as some of the third-party checks, as I mentioned earlier, checking your vendors or your partners, and then the regulatory inspections as well. So I think those have all started coming back, and it's showing us where some of the issues are lying, either because people are rusty, they're not following their laws or the rules, or just because maybe they're not mature enough in their organizational technical skills or quality or compliance organization.
For the listeners, we're talking with Gaurav Walia, who is Senior Director of Business Development, Principal Computer Systems Validation and Data Integrity Consultant, and Senior Associate Partner for the PQE Group, who's really focused on all of these topics that we've been talking to date. So I guess the role of PQE would be to get a company internally and their quality controls to be in compliance so that if a regulatory inspection occurred, they would be able to pass that with flying colors then, Gaurav.
That's well said. I think a lot of organizations will tackle in two fashions. So one or three. One will be if they already have some known issues from an inspection or from a quality audit, where they might need help from an outside party that has expertise in various areas that you mentioned. The other would be, in many cases, companies that are being preventative will employ our services to do gap assessments in different areas, from quality to compliance, even specifically in some of the bread and butter core categories or strengths of our business, coming from computer system validation and data integrity. From there, basically, several organizations will get a report and they'll see where the risks lie. And from that, in many cases, they will employ ourselves or a combination of doing basically to perform the remediation, correct the problems prior to an inspection. Lastly would be what we call audit or inspection readiness. It's really targeting different areas, not just CSV and data integrity, but other areas as well that could pose a risk. Basically looking at these systems or areas and processes of business and basically helping those clients and organizations optimize their potential for success during an inspection, or even sometimes the corporate quality audits that they have internally are equally important, and so they want to perform well as well. So companies will do this often to ensure that they're not only audit ready or inspection ready, but also to ensure that, for example, during COVID or every few years, that you're not falling off or going away from what you said you were going to do or improve.
So you've just talked about what some of the best practices would be, but let's assume you're the CIO of a multinational company. Basically, what would you do to ensure that you would have CSV and compliance and data integrity for your firm?
I think it starts with understanding where do you fall on the performance chart. Do you have gaps in certain areas? Is the technology being tested and ensuring that it's working properly on a frequent basis? As well as even today, a CIO would be concerned with cybersecurity. Today, I won't name the firms, but there's been instances over the last decade where entire laboratories, their technologies were seized that couldn't operate for 6 months, losing hundreds of millions of dollars. On the counterpart, in the medical device space, there's known cases where people hack into somebody's device. Now, I bring this example enough, and it's not funny, but this is known cases where people have access, for example, an infusion pump or something delivering medication to the hospital, and could potentially alter the medication levels, turn off the device. Imagine if somebody did that with the pacemaker or something heart-related and could turn it on or turn it off. These are some of the key areas that I think that a CIO or industry has been focused on. And then ultimately today, both from industry and any kind of quality audit or regulatory inspection, the following three things are often stated. We want to make sure that data integrity is in place and is being checked to make sure that the data itself is being secured, is not being manipulated, is not being deleted or changed for the interest of selling a product. I wouldn't say that many people falsify, but there are instances where people are throwing out data where something doesn't pass, or taking two different batches and trying to combine them just so they could sell it to market, obviously, which is against the law. Basically, overall, I think these are the critical aspects. People want to ensure the last two, which is the product is safe, that you're making it safe, the systems are safe that help make that product. Because it's just like if you were cooking in a kitchen, and I'm famous for my weird, quirky analogies, but it's just like if you're cooking in a kitchen, you don't wash your hands or you don't follow the instructions of how to make that pizza properly. There's a good chance that you could contaminate that pizza, somebody could get sick, or just a complaint in general. And same thing when it comes to manufacturing. There's much more of a risk when it comes to a pharmaceutical product or a medical device, in that it's helping a patient's life, or it could be helping them live. And if it's not done correctly from a product quality standpoint, then the result could be indirect or direct outcome of an adverse event or patient safety, basically, more or less. In the past, we've been more documentation focused, and I think today it's more looking at the end game and then working your way backwards to make sure that you can achieve the process, and your state of quality and compliance helps you to achieve a good product and have safeness within the people taking your medication or medical device.
You're talking about numerous challenges the industry had, and guess what? The challenges increased during COVID because basically it was probably easier to inspect and ensure quality when everybody was in one location. But now that you have the remote workforce, I would imagine it creates different challenges. So what do you see as some of these challenges and some of the best practices that people have implemented related to the hybrid and remote workforce that we have today?
I remember being at the beginning of COVID and stuck in a hotel. I was doing just that. I was doing your gap assessment where I wanted to see, and very similarly speaking, either people are not in the same building, or they're not in the same conference room, or they're not in front of a system. If I'm looking at a tablet press that makes tablets, if I want to see what kind of gaps are there, it makes it much more difficult pre-COVID, and then even at the beginning of COVID, unless you advance your technology. So how do I stand in front of a computerized system and see, are the right people accessing the system? Do they have user IDs and passwords? And are we following our procedures and global policies when it comes to security, configuration of the system? And that becomes difficult. And literally, I remember sitting in the hotel room in the lobby and having people use either a cell phone or a laptop camera, and the picture quality wasn't as good. It was hard. Sometimes they had to communicate what they're trying to show you. And so imagine you're sharing data with somebody else, or now you're inspecting your own other site or doing a quality check, say in manufacturing or in a laboratory space. You're in the United States as part of a corporate quality group. You're inspecting another site of yours all the way out, let's say in Australia or India. Not so easy. So I think utilizing having the bandwidth, having proper Wi-Fi connections within the facilities is one thing that has been a gap in the past, where companies were not ready for that. Having the infrastructure to be able to support more data being shared back and forth, more remote workers, or basically being virtual, if you will, was another gap that companies had to increase their bandwidths, and where do they share data, how they share data, how they protect that data. And overall, I think those have been some of the even today within many companies, the challenge is how do you satisfy what you should be doing normally and making sure you have a good quality system and compliance and do what you normally did? How do you go back to normal life as best as possible, even when you're working from home? I think utilization of different social tools, using Microsoft Teams, for example, or virtual marketplaces where you can utilize tools to be able to communicate. How do you store, share, and protect that data? Whether you're sharing it internally, or if you're checking a vendor, if you're sharing it with an agency or regulatory body, these become important. And I think from speaking at conferences with some major industry partners, I think those companies that started that endeavor to dry run it and see how it works and where the gaps lie. Maybe the picture quality is not great. The lighting's not great. I have a dead spot in the facility where I can't show you, hey, this is how I'm storing my medications properly, for example. So these are what companies had piloted and pivoted away from the normal in-person, on-site, flying from one location to another where I can see it face-to-face or in front of a computerized system, for example. And this is improved, although I think a lot of companies are still not back to normal when it comes to it.
Well, they're not back to normal. They're trying to adjust to the new normal.
Correct.
Which hasn't really been totally defined yet. So I guess the key is, based on all of this that you've observed and the challenges of what the new normal is at this point, what do you predict to be some of the computer systems validation trends that will be emerging in the future based on where we are today and where technology is also emerging?
I think one of the new trends is alluding to something we talked about earlier, but basically there's a new draft guidance called CSA, or Computer Software Assurance. And I think the trend is going in that fashion where even some companies are already starting to implement it, even though it's not become a law or a regulation yet. But more or less, to give you an analogy or comparison between CSV and CSA. So traditionally over the last 50 plus years, computer system validation has been a documentation activity, or what some people might call a checklist. It's been based on what do I create from a documentation standpoint to prove that my process is working, my system is working, my computerized system is working properly to make that safe drug or product. And what it wasn't doing is focusing on what's the risk that I have at hand. So, for example, and what we call critical thinking. Today, those that are starting to implement CSA, and I'll mention why that helps from an efficiency and technology standpoint. CSA basically says utilize the opposite methodology and take critical thinking and really decide, what are my risks from a quality perspective? What's my risk to the patient? What's my risk from a validation standpoint or data integrity that could affect my product? Or maybe historically, I know I have some issues here and I should put better focus on that, more or less, versus doing the same testing over and over again that people have done for many years. So let me give you an example. If you have a software system that has been well deployed in the marketplace, it maybe has 10,000 deployments, has been around 40 years, companies have been routinely just testing the out of the box, or COTS, they call it commercial off the shelf functionality. Today, companies or even industry and the agency might say that this is basically a wasted effort, especially if you have a good vendor risk management program and you've audited your vendors, they have a good quality system. If you've documented that, then you can leverage that and the deployments in the industry and focus on things that have configured or customized. CSA basically flips the way that business has been done for several decades and says, focus on where the risk lies that could affect the data or the product or the patient. And also based on your track record or historical knowledge of those systems where there may be risk. So applying the critical thinking to apply how you perform those quality activities or testing. And then from that, the last step would be, how do I document? Funny example, I remember at my first job more than 25 years ago, when there's an inspection, we used to pull in carts worth of paperwork. And the bigger the cart or the heavier the paperwork or the bigger the pile, the mountain of paperwork, basically, literally where you barely could see the inspector's face. And it was what? To keep them busy. And number two, we thought quantity means quality. And of course it doesn't. Today, the shift that's starting to occur is it's not about the amount of paperwork, but the focus to ensure, again, that the product is safe, what we call the intended use. How do I plan on using that system, that software, that manufacturing tool, that laboratory equipment to ensure the product is safe before I sell it to the public and to make sure the patient is safe? So I think that's not a technology, but it's basically a draft regulation that's out there. And I think technologically speaking, the difference is that people are now starting to think better, even before they purchase the technology. What do I really need? What am I trying to achieve? That's the best way. Too many times, somebody buying a car not knowing what it's for. Sorry again for my quirky analogies, but would you buy a Lamborghini to drive up a snowy mountain that has 5 feet of snow and routinely snows versus when I take a Lamborghini as my main car to drive only to go to the grocery store? So it's really understanding what your needs are and buying the technology and the tools that you need in accordance to that to be able to satisfy your end goals.
The challenge becomes, I think, for a lot of early stage and small companies, what advice do you have for companies to ensure that they have CSV compliance regardless of size, and when should they begin it?
Again, as I said at the beginning of the conversation, when I was a research chemist, and there's different phases of research, and some are early stage in the product lifecycle development from phase 1 to phase 4. So in early stages, I used to have a lot of colleagues that would say, oh, well, it's early, it's still research. We don't need to be totally well strictness of GMP or good manufacturing practice or GXP, which can cover good laboratory practices, good manufacturing practices, good documentation practices, et cetera. And really what I always found was to have a good foundation, even early in development in an organization, is important because you're building a culture. It's not just checking off a box on a piece of paper to say I'm doing it or I'm not. It's implementing a culture within the organization, improving upon that culture. And many companies have continuous improvement projects, which include, how do I train people? How do I show them? So for example, many companies will do an annual GMP training, and it's the same training over and over and over again. And the gap is that people are doing the training to satisfy a requirement to check off a box versus maybe I'd change the format. If it's your first time, your first day, your first year, your first job in industry, that makes sense to have that kind of training. As you move forward in your career, either you have different types of training that are more advanced that also combine, in my opinion, what are some of the gaps you experienced in the last year? What are some of the problems that you had? What are some of the mistakes that people made? And I think learning from your mistakes is what's important to ensure that the gaps are corrected and improving. So back to your original question, when should it be implemented? It should be done on day one. It should be done on day one. It also should have some harmony or harmonization between the organization because you have different disciplines from research to IT, to quality, to compliance, to regulatory groups, just to name a few. And it's important that everybody speaks the same language coming into the room. And it's important that at least there's some common thread of discussion and sharing of information that everybody can understand. Because at the end of the day, it's the total package that gets looked at potentially, as well as specific areas can be looked at during an audit or inspection. So my advice to companies is understand where your risks lie. Earlier, I said I've been involved in consent decrees, and consent decrees is legal injunctions where you can be stopped from manufacturing a drug for 4 or 5 years or your product, or you fix your problems, right? It's a serious legal designation that comes from usually quality manufacturing issues. And so it's important for people to learn from their mistakes and really understand where their gaps lie, because what you don't know is what you don't know. And as we talked about, even during COVID more especially, people have not been performing tasks. They're off their game, more or less, if you will, because they've got rusty, because they've not been doing it or they've not been inspected. And so there's a lot of turnover in the industry too. So you get new bodies, or you're getting people that are not going into the office. People are working in a different mindset. Of course, if you're making a drug, you still have to go on site to produce a product. So that interaction becomes important. So being able to develop that culture, whether it's internally or getting outside help, and is at the same time spot checking different areas throughout the year or over the course of a few years highlighting different areas where you might have risk and improving those gaps and fixing them is really what I would recommend.
So you're a gap specialist, Gaurav.
My executive director of research and development, when I was probably in my second job, called me a chameleon. And more or less, it was, before we were calling it gaps, it was really being a problem solver. Even if it wasn't an area that you may work in every day, it takes a certain personality and skill set to be able to walk into any room in front of any system, talk to any individual, or look at something and be able to quickly identify where there's gaps or significant issues. And again, that's where you assign the risk level. What's the effect of where it doesn't meet or it's failing?
As we come to a close of this special podcast on this new topic we've had on computer system validation and data integrity, I want to thank Gaurav Walia, who's the Senior Director of Business Development and Principal Computer System Validation and Data Integrity Consultant and Senior Associate Partner for the PQE Group. And I'm sure the listeners may have an interest in learning more from you. So how would they get in touch with you, Gaurav, or the PQE Group?
Thank you for having me here today. It's been a wonderful discussion. For those that are interested in learning more about PQE Group or absolute needs, you can look us up on www.pqegroup.com. You can also find PQE Group on LinkedIn. You can find myself, Gaurav Walia, on LinkedIn, as well as my email address is g.walia, W-A-L-I-A, at pqegroup.com.
Super. And it'll be easier to find you with that email address than your title, Gaurav. So I want to thank you for being on BioTalk today and look forward to seeing you in the future, Gaurav.
Thank you, Rich. Appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to BioTalk with Rich Bendis.